The Happy Prince. A statue of the Happy Prince stood on a tall post above the city. His lead body was covered in gold leaf, and his eyes were beautiful sapphires. On his sword was a large red ruby. Everyone in the city loved the prince's beauty and his positive attitude. One night, a swallow flew over the city. He had been separated from his flock. While the other birds left to spend winter in Egypt, the swallow stayed behind. As night approached, he settled down between the prince's feet to go to sleep. Suddenly, he felt a few drops of water fall on him, even though it wasn't raining. Tears were running down the prince's face. The prince explained that when he was alive, he was rich and lived in a palace. He got his name because he was always happy. After he died, people made a statue of him, and he could look over the whole city. From up high, he saw the sadness of many people's poverty.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to English for You. I'm Mike.
I'm Chickling.
And today we are going to be beginning a 3-day article about the story, The Happy Prince.
The Happy Prince, 快
Yes.
乐王子. So it's a prince that's happy?
It's a prince, well, kind of a prince that's kind of happy. We're going to have to read the story. I don't want to spoil it all. A lot of people might get this confused with The Little Prince, right? That's the famous one about the little boy who travels through space and travels by plane and ends up in a desert and makes friends with a flower and stuff. It's not that story. It's a different one, but it's about a prince who kind of is happy. It's actually, well, we should just get into the story.
Okay,
what do you say? We just start the story.
Sure.
So let's do that. And we're going to be reading this for 3 days. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going to happen. We don't want to spoil it, but we might tell people that they could possibly need a box of tissue paper at the end of the story. Yeah, there's a little bit of emotional stuff that goes on. So that's why it's a good story and a story people have been reading for a very long time. Let's get into it. A statue of the Happy Prince stood on a tall post above the city. So there you go. It isn't actually a prince. It's a statue of a prince. It's already interesting, isn't it? And what exactly is a statue? A statue is a figure of a person or an animal, possibly, made in stone, metal, wood, whatever, and it's basically a 3-dimensional piece of art, and we're representing that person. Usually we will have statues of famous people, important people, people that have some strong connection to a place, a country, or a big event. Think of statues of important people like presidents or kings or leaders or famous people or something like that. If you go on to do something amazing with your life, someone might put up a statue of you. Is it similar to a sculpture, which is also 3D art? Yes, but a statue will be of a person or an animal or something. It won't just be like an interesting shape, which a sculpture could also be. And it will also be a person you can recognize, probably. Here's one example that most of you might know of. Many tourists go to see and take pictures of the statue of the movie star Bruce Lee by Hong Kong Harbor. Have you seen that one? He's kind of in a fighting action pose.
Yeah.
His muscles are all rippling and stuff. And yeah, if you go down there almost any time of the day, there will be people there because, of course, Bruce Lee was famous, had lots of fans. People want to see the statue.
所以 statue 就是雕像的意思。那我们文章中出现的 A statue of the Happy Prince 代表就是这个快乐王子的雕像。我们可以造一个句子 The city plans to build a statue of the famous leader. 我们课文中一开始是说快乐王子的雕像呢伫立在城市上方的一根高柱上。
That's right. There are a lot of statues of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, right?
Oh, yeah,
in
in
different
Taiwan.
parts of
Yes.
Taiwan, especially around schools and stuff like that. All right, so it's a statue. It's clearly not a real boy, a young man, a prince. It says his lead body was covered in gold leaf and his eyes were beautiful sapphires. Yeah. So, of course, he's not made of skin and bone like a person. It's a statue. So he's made of, as we said, statues are made of stone, metal. He was made of different types of metal. His lead body, so his body is made with this metal called lead. It was covered in gold leaf, so it was lead on the inside, which is kind of a medium dark gray color, but it was very shiny because it was covered in like a thin layer of gold. That's gold leaf. And his eyes were beautiful sapphires. Wow, he had beautiful blue stones for his eyes.
所以呢 lead 就是铅，那我们看到另外一个字 sapphire， 这是蓝宝石的意思，所以这个王子的铅质身体呢，覆盖着金箔，眼睛是美丽的蓝宝石。
Right. Sapphires, of course, are very expensive jewels. Lead is a very soft, cheap, and poisonous metal, so try to stay away from lead. But hey, if you can find lots of sapphires, take those. Back to the article, it says, on his sword was a large red ruby. Ooh, okay. So being a prince, he's the son of a king. It kind of makes sense that he might be carrying a sword. Even occasionally now, I think Prince William has to wear a sword when he's doing his official prince stuff there in Britain. So he's got a sword, and on the sword is a large red ruby, another very expensive jewel stone, gemstone. Rubies are red, where sapphires, of course, are blue. Everyone in the city loved the prince's beauty and his positive attitude. All right, so what is a sword? A sword is basically a weapon with a long metal blade. Think of a really, really big knife. Swords were basically the main weapon that people would carry until guns became popular and became easier to use and more effective. But for hundreds of years, going back to even before the time of the Romans and the Greeks, the Egyptians, they used swords up until probably the mid-19th century. Swords were still very common in battles, but it's basically a long cutting weapon and with a handle as well that you hold as you swing your sword, like the guy in our example sentence. The hero pulled out his sword and then ran to join the battle while yelling, "Charge!" And he immediately got shot by an arrow.
Sword 就是剑或者是刀，比如说 the knight 骑士 The knight drew his sword in defense 就是他要防御自己。那么这个 ruby 就是红宝石，所以这个可爱的这个王子呢，镶嵌着他的剑上镶嵌着大大的红宝石。城市里面每个人都很喜欢王子的美貌跟他乐观的态度哦。那这边也包含我们 language and focus. Let's take a look. 我们今天讲到的是地方副词倒装句。那么一般的句子呢，它的句构为 S 加 V 加地方副词片语。可是我们的句型呢，是将地方副词片语呢置在句首或句子前方去倒装，我们拿来强调地点的描述，是比较正式的用法，也可以让整个句子比较具有文学性。那倒装的时候呢，句中的主词跟动词位置就要互换了。我们先看一下 A photograph of a peaceful lake rests on the shelf。 好，这个我们把它倒装怎么讲呢？我们就把后面的东西 on the shelf 移到前面。 On the shelf rests a photograph of a peaceful lake。 那么写成倒装句的时候呢，动词单数啊或复数变化还是要跟我们的主词一致哦。比如说 Behind the bookstore stands a small cafe that serves the best coffee in town。 那这边的 small cafe 因为它是单数嘛，所以我们的 stand 才必须要使用 s 的部分。 On the hill are a few children flying kites。 这边的 few children a few children 是复数，所以我们前面的 be 动词才会使用 are。
All right, so here we have our little prince, or our happy prince, I should say, standing as a statue. One night, a swallow flew over the city. Okay, that's interesting. A swallow being a type of bird. They're rather small. I think they're quite fast swallows too, but a pretty common bird. But it flew over the city. He, the swallow, had been separated from his flock. Oh, that's too bad. He's lost his gang, his friends, his family. A flock is basically a word we would use for a group of animals. You have to be careful with this because certain animals can be called certain things in groups that doesn't always work with other kinds of animals. So a flock would be a group of birds, for example, a group of sheep. For example, if you see a group of fish in the ocean, that's not a flock. That's a school of fish. And we would also talk about a herd of goats or a herd of horses or something like that. But a flock is definitely a word you would use for a group of birds. You might see a flock of birds flying around at night as they hunt and eat. We could say, for example, the shepherd and his sheepdog protect the large flock of sheep from wolves and other dangers.
So swallow 就是燕子，那么 flock 我们常常英文里面会形容禽类啊、绵羊或山羊等一群的意思。The farmer had a large flock of sheep grazing in the field， 这个 grazing 就是放牧的意思。那么 in a flock 我们有时候也会这样讲 The birds flew in a flock across the horizon。 所以某个夜晚呢，这个一只燕子飞过了城市，它跟鸟群失散了。
All right, so this bird was with a big group of other birds, but became separated, kind of ended up on its own. It says, while the other birds left to spend winter in Egypt, the swallow stayed behind. Oh, okay. So I guess we can guess that this story probably happens in Europe somewhere, because most of the other birds, his flock, flew south to Egypt, which of course is a warm country. They can spend the winter there and then fly back north to Europe in the spring and summer. But this swallow decided not to follow the flock to Egypt. This swallow decided to stay behind, to stay in Europe or wherever they are, and try to live through the cold winter months.
所以呢，当其他的鸟儿呢飞往埃及过冬的时候，燕子却留了下来哦。
Okay, and then it says, as night approached, he, that's the swallow, as night approached, he settled down between the prince's feet to go to sleep. So it's nighttime. Most birds don't fly at nighttime. They'll find a tree or somewhere to sit down and, have a nap, take a break, sleep through the night. So that's what happened as night approached. He settled down. When you settle down, you kind of make yourself comfortable between the prince's feet to go to sleep. I think most of us have seen birds sitting on statues on the head or the shoulders or down between the feet. And the bird was doing this, getting ready for bed as we do as night approaches. If something approaches, it comes closer to you, so it can happen physically. Like before you can get on the bus, you have to wait for the bus to approach the bus stop and stop to let you on. But we can also use it to talk about time, something coming closer. If it's Thursday or Friday, you could say, for example, oh, cool, the weekend is approaching. I really need some time off. Here's another example. The final exams are approaching. They're getting closer. Have you started studying yet? Because I guess the exams might be in a week or two.
所以呢 approach 在我们文章中是动词，有接近的意思。当名词也有方法，我们常常会说 adopt or to take an approach to do something. They decided to adopt a new approach to solving the issue. 或者是说呢 a different approach 就是不一样的方式哦。那么我们文章中出现的 settle down 指的是处于舒适的位置。所以夜幕降临啊，这个燕子就停在王子的脚边准备入睡了。
Okay, suddenly it says, as this bird is getting comfortable for the nighttime, suddenly he, that's of course the swallow, he felt a few drops of water fall on him, even though it wasn't raining. How unusual.
哇，所以这个 even though 就是尽管的意思。所以突然呢，他就感到有几滴水落在自己的身上，而且天上是没有在下雨的哟。
So where did this water come from? Well, we read tears were running down the prince's face. How strange. This statue seems to be crying. Statues don't cry because statues are made of metal and only people cry, of course, when they're sad or maybe happy sometimes, but generally sad. So the statue is crying. And then, even stranger, the statue begins to speak. It says the prince, the statue of the prince, explained that when he was alive, he was rich and lived in a palace. So the prince is talking to the swallow in this story. And the prince is saying, oh, when I was alive, I was rich and I had a magnificent, wonderful life. I lived in a palace, which, makes sense because princes, like princesses and kings and queens, their parents, are royal people. And a palace is a grand royal home, a really big house, usually for kings and queens and people like that. It's not a castle, so it won't be kind of a war-fighting structure with a big wall around it and towers. No, palaces usually have big windows and beautiful gardens. Think of Buckingham Palace in London, where the king lives. Think of the Palace of Versailles outside Paris, which is huge, hundreds and hundreds of rooms, huge gardens, and it is very luxurious, very big, very expensive, and very beautiful. For example, the king and queen lived in a huge palace with over 300 rooms and hundreds of servants. Wow, what a life.
所以 palace 就是皇宫或宫殿。所以比如说 the royal family lived in a grand palace overlooking the city. 所以其实这个水是来自于王子的脸上，他在哭，那王子就跟这个燕子说，其实他活着的时候很富有，他住在一座宫殿里面。
And then the statue of this prince, this happy prince, explains to the swallow where he got that name. It says he got his name because he was always happy. After he died, people made a statue of him and he could look over the whole city. So this happy prince was obviously loved by the people, and that's why when he died, they made a statue of him, and from that position, he can look over the whole city.
所以他的名字之所以叫快乐王子，是因为他以前都是快快乐乐的，只是他过世了之后，人们就为他立了一座雕像，让他可以俯瞰整座城市。
But although he had been a happy prince in life, as a statue looking over the city, he's not always happy. It says, from up high, where he is now as a statue, from up high, he saw the sadness of many people's poverty. Wow, this might be something he wouldn't have seen living in the palace, right? Where the poor people might have been far away from him and he didn't sort of mix with them very often. But what he saw in the real world outside the palace now is sadness. A lot of people are very sad. Their lives are very difficult. They don't have a lot of happiness or things to look forward to. And a big part of that is because they are poor. They live a life of poverty. And poverty is basically when you really don't have money. It's not just like, oh dear, I spent too much yesterday. I can't, buy more stuff today. It's more like I don't have enough money to buy food to eat. Or I can choose between paying for somewhere to live and paying for something to eat. I can't pay for both. That's poverty. So when you're really desperate in your life, when you just don't make enough to support your life, you live in poverty. And of course, that is a terrible, terrible situation for anyone to be in. For example, we could say it's hard to believe and completely unacceptable that thousands of people in rich countries still have to live in poverty.
所以 poverty 就是贫困或贫穷，所以你可以说住在贫穷里面，就是有受这个贫穷之苦。Many families in this region live in poverty， 就是这边的很多的家庭呢都是处于贫困状态。所以其实从高处呢，这个王子可以看到许多人的贫困与悲伤哦，也就是为什么他在哭。
All right, so we have a question before we say goodbye for today. Remember, there's 2 more days of the story coming up. But our question for today is, what's the most famous statue or building where you live, and how do people feel about it?
Actually, I have no idea, but there's this one famous statue in Taiwan. It's the Buddha.
The Buddha?
In Zhanghua.
In Zhanghua?
Yeah,
okay.
And people worship it, and it just looks so cute.
Zhanghua down by Taichung. I'm trying to think. I think I've been through there. I've certainly been by on the train or something. What's so special about this Buddha?
I think it's just like it's a place where people go worship and just go wish for good luck, health. Basically like a temple.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting. So it's quite famous. Do you think if I saw a picture of it, would I be able to?
Yes, recognize. You would be able to recognize it. I would definitely
be able to recognize it. Okay.
Yes.
Let's see. What's one that I would know? Well, since I'll pick something outside of Taiwan. Some people might know I'm from Montreal in Canada. And there's one famous building there, the Notre Dame Basilica. Not Notre Dame Cathedral, which is, of course, in Paris, that one that had the fire a few years ago. This is similar. It's a big church, not quite as big, not quite as old, but very beautiful inside. And I think some people might know it or just be interested in it because that's where Celine Dion got married many, many years ago. So there you go. And certainly most tourists, when they come to Montreal to visit, they will definitely check it out. I went a few years ago with a friend. I just hadn't been there in years. I was amazed at how really beautiful it was inside. So I kind of was happy that I had this reason to be a tourist in my own hometown. So what about you guys? Can you have a think and a chat about what's the most famous statue or building where you live? And yeah, do people like it? But we have more story for you tomorrow. So please come back and join us for that.
So 听完今天的节目，如果还觉得学得不够尽兴，欢迎到空中家教与我们的老师一起练习哦。
Vocabulary Review.
Statue. One of this city's most famous sights is the statue of the first president. It looks just like him. Sword. The soldiers used swords to protect themselves and attack their enemies during the fight. Flock. When the farmer called, the flock of sheep quickly followed him as they knew it was feeding time. Approach. When winter approaches, the weather starts getting colder and the days become shorter. Palace. The king ordered his people to build a new palace for him and his queen. Poverty. This area is experiencing terrible poverty. Many families can't even buy food.
智慧小补帖
Lead, sapphire, ruby, swallow.